Okay, you're good to go.
Perfect. Hello, everyone, and welcome to our presentation today on our view of solving the zero trust puzzle for Canadian organization. We'll go through some introductions in a bit. Ivo Weens and KJ Burke will be presenting today. I know that Cassandra has also talked about, you've received an email from CDW Marketing about an Uber Eats gift certificate that's coming. That's coming after the presentation, so marketing will send that over to you. I'm going to get started. It looks like we got already a pretty good group here today. In terms of agenda today, here's what we're talking about. We're talking about solving the zero trust puzzle, right? Talking about how we can do it for Canadian organizations and what we can do to help with that. We'll go through some introductions. KJ and I will introduce ourselves. We'll go through what is and what isn't zero trust. We'll talk about setting our goal here today and what we want to do and what we want to understand. We'll talk about finding the corner pieces. So what are the 4 first steps that are really important in getting zero trust implemented in your organization? We'll talk about the centerpieces. How do we bring it all together? Common pitfalls, culture challenges we may have with implementing zero trust in organizations, and then that second last bullet is where we're going to bring KJ in to really have that wider IT view, that we could have the wider view within the organization outside of our little security bubble. And if there is time, we can have a Q&A. KJ will be monitoring the chat for me throughout the presentation, but likely we'll save all the questions until the end. So without further ado, I'm Ivo Weens. I'm the Senior Manager Security Solutions Architecture for CDW Canada. So I've been in the information security industry for over 15 years. I started in the more penetration testing, vulnerability assessment side of the house, moved over to consulting, managed the SOC for a number of years, and then really got into the architecture side and manage a team of 18 solution architects that some of you may know across the country. So our team is constantly growing. We're constantly helping clients solve these kind of security problems, find technology solutions for solving security problems within the CDW, the wide CDW client base. So I'm going to have KJ introduce himself. KJ.
Yeah, I'll keep it quick. Thanks, Ivo. So KJ Burke, Principal Technology Strategist around Hybrid Cloud for CDW. So my focus is to help guide our strategy around what we do in the data center, what we do in the public cloud for our customers. And fortunately, as security has really become something that's important across the entire infrastructure, whether it's in the cloud, whether it's a SaaS service, whether it's in the data center, I've been able to work with Ivo and his team and help customers holistically approach some of these security topics. My background primarily is on the customer side. I spent a lot of time with Barrett Gold and with OpenText doing corporate IT architecture. Coming along from the Scalar vein, I've been working with Ivo for I think 5 or 6 years now, and learn a lot from him and his team. So thanks for having me as part of this, and I'm interested to hear the presentation.
Fantastic. Thanks, KJ. I also noticed that our pictures look like before and afters of what we're all right now, going through pandemics, but hopefully we get outside again. Fantastic. Thanks, KJ. Let's start talking about zero trust, and I always like to talk about zero trust by starting about what it isn't. I think that there's a lot of misconceptions about it, and it's a good way to start thinking about it, right? Zero trust is not a magic pill. There's no magic easy button or technology you can buy that'll give you zero trust. And everybody says, well, it's a journey. It absolutely is. Are there technologies that'll help you on the path to zero trust? Absolutely. Are there technologies that will enable your organization to implement a zero trust network architecture? Yes. Are there assessments you can perform to help you get a better posture to what zero trust is and understanding better? Yes, there are. But there is no organization that has achieved 100% zero trust. Different organizations are approaching each problem differently based on a number of different variables. The 2 best documents that I'm going to reference through this, and that's, I think they really outline with great detail what Zero Trust is are the National Institute of Technology, NIST's document on Zero Trust, and the special document, special presentation from the Department of Defense on the implementation of Zero Trust. So both those documents are great, and I'll have a link at the end of the presentation, and hopefully we get to send this deck out and have your thoughts on it as well. So I'll be referencing them, but as you can imagine, these are not simple documents. They're not everyday solution documents, but rather how you can implement this in really complex environments. Implementing those 100% of those documents would take a long time and likely cripple your organization. So today we'll scratch the surface, and hopefully come out with a solid plan. So another point that I like to make about Zero Trust, that it's not something you do alone. It's not a leaders only. It's not your CISO that owns it. It's your whole organization, right? You need to expand beyond that security team. It's not a leaders only, not an analyst only project, and more importantly, it's not a security only play. And when we have the conversation later with KJ, I think that'll really come clear on the perception, the outside security perception of Zero Trust. So now that we've covered what it isn't, let's dig a little deeper on what it is. A special publication from NIST that I talked about, 800-207, says an evolving set of cybersecurity paradigms that move defenses from static network-based perimeters to focus on user, assets, and resources. Zero Trust is a model for security focused on data and service protection, but can be expanded to all enterprise assets. So if you think about it, Zero Trust popularity has really soared during the pandemic, as you can imagine, because if you're looking at changing from static network-based perimeters and starting focus on user, assets, and resources, that is obviously quite popular because of the new shape of our networks, right? The new shape that everybody's working remote, and networks are now highly dependent, and security is highly dependent on what's done on the user side. The main concepts, obviously, trust but verify. A user needs access to enterprise resources, but all access needs a policy decision point. The policy does not trust the user or device by default. So think of the policy as a black box between the user and the protected asset. So that is one of the main tenets of Zero Trust. So it's a prescriptive model. It's not a prescriptive model like a compliance framework, right? So it's rather a set of guiding principles that need to make sense for your organization, for workflow, for system design, and operations. And when balanced with continuous monitoring, Zero Trust architecture can protect against common threats and improve organizational security posture by using a managed risk approach. Like any other control that's implemented in information security, monitoring, continuously improving it, and making sure that it's configured correctly is important, right? So monitoring is a big piece of getting a Zero Trust architecture in place and making sure that architecture is set up, right? And other concepts that usually people talk about when they talk about Zero Trust is assuming compromise, right? Assume that endpoints are compromised. Remove the lateral movement. So if we talk about lateral movement, it used to be quite common when we're all sitting in one big happy network back in the day. Now that we're VPNing in, it doesn't always mean that we're not sitting in a one big happy network, because that can happen with VPNs as well. So another concept that's also thrown around a lot is treat every location like a coffee shop, right? It used to be that we had some control in terms of physical security, but as people start to work remote more and more, we have to really start thinking broader, right? That every network that's out there, every device, and the verification of users becomes very important, right? So I'm going to start and kind of flip things back a little bit and talk about one of my favorite analogies for thinking about Zero Trust. So let's use the analogy of your property, right? A house on a street with a yard. So a single dwelling location on a public street. When you approach this property, when people approach this property, you have a number of options, right? Do you let them into your yard? You can let them into your garage. You can let them into your house. You can let them into your bedroom. that helps us understand the perimeters, but then we understand the who, right? For example, a good friend comes to visit. What does she have access to? How do you know? And again, how do you know who they are? And a contractor, the meter person, your mom, right? They all have different access within different areas of your house. And then once they're in, what specific objects will they have access to? Will they have access to the breaker box? Will they have access to the sink? Will they have access to your banking info, your mortgage papers, your computer? What will they be allowed and authorized to do on those things? Can they watch TV? Can they rip out your flooring? They change your sheets? Can they read your meter, right? What will they be doing while they're, will you be with them while they're doing it? Are you going to monitor their activity when they're in there? And all this also has the context that needs to be run on top of it as to why are they there? The same person with different purposes means something completely different in terms of time and task, right? So it's important to imagine somebody coming at 3 a.m. is very different than someone coming over at 2 p.m, unless there's a reason behind it or a justification behind it. Now, take that concept and say, imagine now you're in a condo building. Does that change what you have control over? It changes very little in terms of your own policy, but you become dependent on a trusted third party. So this trusted third party who runs your building is in charge of authenticating, authorizing, and managing access to multiple perimeters that you have no control over. So those who, this is a simple analogy, and those who know the shared responsibility model for cloud know exactly what I'm getting at here. The responsibility shifts on a number of policy decisions, right? With all this in mind, the decision we need to make about securing the enterprise, they're very similar to this, and the analogy should be fairly obvious. But in the last few years, we've had a crash course on what it's important to us and the levels of risk we're willing to take, right? So everything from going to the grocery store to going everywhere, going anywhere requires a little bit of a risk assessment that you're doing with a number of different controls that you're putting into place. So that the idea of zero trust is very natural to us in understanding. But let's assume the correct mindset and move it over to the IT side of the house, right? To look at zero trust, we need to look at it with the right mindset. So from a who perspective, on the IT side of the house, we have the identity and authentication. In the middle, you see the what. So data, the data is what we're protecting here, right? So this is one of the most important pieces. What we're protecting here and where we're going to start is very important, and what is that we're doing. And obviously, the user device location, we talked about location dependency, and that can still be important even though our shape is changing. It's important to understand geographic location and behavior patterns as well. There's context, right? The why are you there? Why did you show up, and when did you show up, and what are your reasons for doing this? And then the why, right? The business process that's supporting what you're doing and attaching role-based authentication to that. So as an IT professional, you can start to see the list of controls you currently have in place. You're looking through this and going, well, we have some, we have others. But, and that's a good thing, but we can't just start deploying them willy-nilly, right? So we have to start setting a plan here. So taking on our puzzle analogy, which will start soon, let's first set the goal. The goal today is to discuss zero trust architecture implementation guidance while, and holding these in place is very important for us, leveraging existing investments where possible. So as we looked at what we already looked at, hopefully some of the controls you already purchased or have in place from a long time ago start coming to mind, right? Active Directory has had controls around when people can log in for a long time, right? So leveraging some of those existing controls could be important. Firewalls can give you some visibility. Your SIM could give you some visibility. There are tools that already may be in place, may already be deployed, that can give you some level of zero trust. So we want to make sure then when we're talking about this, we're not talking about a rip and replace, right? We're not talking about taking everything out. As much as your CDW account manager would love that, this is not something we're talking about here. We're talking about leveraging the existing investment where possible, right? Growing that zero trust footprint without breaking the bank. So what we also want to do is cause the least amount of impact to existing operations. So if you look at the impact that it would take to basically bring in all of zero trust could be very high. So having the least amount of impact to existing operations is important. Security, and I like to say this in almost all my presentations. We've always been known as the Department of No, right? We come into meetings and we say how things aren't possible. So taking a different approach and saying, hey, we want to enable the business, we want to diminish the risk and enable business to operate with very low risk here. And that's what we're here to do, right? Of course, meeting compliance is important, but also we want to make sure that we're carrying beyond that and doing better, taking that risk-based approach, protecting the business. And we also want to use concepts we already know about security. There'll be no magic here. These are, you'll recognize all of these Lego blocks, and you'll know, how, and hopefully you'll have a pretty good idea on how to put this together for your organization. The first piece, and let's start by taking sort of the puzzle analogy and moving forward, right? The first corner piece is finding the important data. So one could attempt to deploy zero trust architecture within all the tenants and everything within your organization, but that's not going to be very successful very fast. So my recommendation is to narrow your scope, right? How is this done? Look for a project, look for an area, look for something that is new, small. And by new, I don't mean bleeding edge, right? Don't try to add controls to something that is very, very new from a technology perspective, but look for a project that has newish, right? You also don't want servers from the 90s as part of this, right? You want to make sure that you're carrying this that way. You want something small and that has a nimble team, and that it does not use bleeding edge technology, right? So don't boil the ocean. Don't try to do this for your organization. Find that project. Narrowing your scope is a challenge you can't take on alone either. So identifying this is important to identify the data and identify what you want to do. Do it in the team, right? Start asking questions like, what is important to keep the business running, and don't answer it with IT answers, right? Don't use technology answers or get wrapped up in that. Just because people yell at you when one service is not running or when they don't have access to a certain thing doesn't mean that that's not the data, right? We were trying to get to that data piece, right? There's a lot of data that you could probably, the path to that important data is typically in things that already been done, right? You look at the output of a TRA, right? A conversation with executives. What are information assets? Which information assets are more important to the business? And more often than not, it's the compliance reports that tell you the story of where the important data is within that project, right? If we're looking at compliance and audit reports, we're maybe looking at private health information. That's an easy one to find. Personal identifiable data, intellectual property data, credit card data. PCI requires a lot of artifacts already that could be used here. So that first piece is identifying where that data is, because according to the zero trust architectures, you want to move your controls as close as possible to that data, right? And obviously that's in a logical sense, move it closer there. So that's the first piece. The second piece, which I consider it the most important, and I'll highlight as to why it's so important later, is user authentication and authorization. So it's very key to get this piece in order. As you can imagine from my analogy, you would not have, without the who, there would be no reason for any perimeters or controls to be put into place, right? So obviously the first place you want to look is in your user directory, be it LDAP or Active Directory or whatever you use, right? That's the easy answer, right? But there's also other things you need to think about, right? Authentication and users, or as we as described in the architectures, they call them subjects, go beyond just what you believe is in your Active Directory and your user directory. Look at users in databases, right? Their username and passwords that may be stored in some systems within a SQL database, for instance. Look for identities in third-party systems. So if we're talking about something like, a SaaS service that's out there that they use, or it could be a third-party storage system, or any other third-party system, be it IaaS or PaaS, that could be identities stored there as well. And remember that apps are people too, right? Apps need to be executed under a context, and typically there's an account, a service account, or sometimes even a user account that's attached to how those applications execute. So important to identify that piece, because malware actors will use will move laterally and find the account that has the most power within that application system. And then the least sexy of all options here is go back and talk about your user policies with your organization, right? Understand what we have in terms of user policy creation, and make sure that those policies are tight specifically for this group in terms of provisioning, deprovisioning, and all the things you would do around policies. And obviously, when we're talking about identifying people and making sure that users are identified, certificates are important, right? Understanding the non-repudiation and the existence of these people is important, right? So having those pieces in place are also important. So that's the user identity piece, highly important. And I'll highlight a little more what services are dependent on it. And then from there, let's go to the third corner piece, which I think is quite important as well. It's device authentication. So a key piece of making sure ZeroTrust works well is physical access. And as we know, physical access to the device is sort of the first and last defense, and device authentication authorization are key to ensuring things like software-defined networking works, segmentation, proper delivery. The right individual using a non-authorized device entering a secure environment can be a dangerous combination. We are not talking about kicking all devices out of the network, but making sure that when it comes to important data, only the right assets have access to this data. So you could think, well, for BYOD, like what do we do about that, right? Does it mean that we cancel all BYOD policies? No, we understand the device authentication and authorization need to happen before a session started, and we need to understand the posture, and we need to give the right level of access for the right combination of device and user. So not a simple combination, but once you understand where your important data assets are, you can make a justification for a certain level of access depending on the location. The fourth piece. So what touches the data, which is really important to figure out now that we've identified where this data is, what needs to be protected, then we need to identify the pieces around it. So applications, which applications consume that sensitive information that we talked about? So, is it off the shelf, custom software? Obviously, in-house developed software gives you all kinds of visibility how the data is accessed. But then off-the-shelf software gives you some shifts the responsibility somewhere else, right? So understanding the applications and the level of access they have to the data that you want to protect is highly important. Further on from there, think about your assets, right? The whole concept of assets has really broadened, right? Not just from laptops or servers or physical devices, but we also have virtual devices, we have ephemeral devices that may be touching this data, right? But don't forget about things like IoT or point of sale systems and those kind of assets as well. So which assets are the most sensitive and which assets are interacting with the data we're talking about? And finally, services, right? In terms of services, don't just think of services running that within the servers that are managing the data, but also think of supporting services that really could be exploited to disturb the normal IT operation. So think of things like DNS, DHCP, Active Directory, whatever could be supporting the services piece. So this next slide really highlights what I want to kind of loop back on, which is the importance of device and user authentication and authorization. So I'm going to go back a couple of slides. Sorry about that. When we look at this slide comes out of it's a diagram on the capabilities dependencies within the Department of Defense Zero Trust reference architecture. So if we look at this diagram, there are some really lofty goals that everybody's trying to reach right now in information security, right? We look at things like, on the right, there's, the DLP. DLP is a box, microsegmentation is a box, application delivery is a big part of it, software-defined networking, device compliance, PAM, right? There are a lot of great services here that we're all chasing in one way or another, be it through technology or be it through another method, right? So these services, while they're very important, and you see the arrows, the green arrows it means that one service requires the other. While they're important, they're all highly dependent on those five boxes, four boxes in one circle you see there, right? We're talking about having proper user authentication, having proper device authentication, and having proper user authorization and device authorization. You see the real, in terms of dependencies, in terms of getting things working in your environment, all those other pieces are great, but if you don't have those four pieces in place, it could be, they will not bring you to a zero trust architecture. So I highly recommend that the document. It's got a lot of great detail in it, but my recommendation when you read it is, take it into your own context, right? You're not running the Department of Defense in the United States, I hope. So once we've identified these corner pieces and talked about those four areas, let's start looking at use cases, right? And use cases is such a common term nowadays, and really I want to focus specifically more now in data flows, right? And be aware that they may already exist, right? Those who have been part of a PCI compliance program in the past know that there will be data flows in there. As part of PCI compliance, you're supposed to build two levels of data flows in there, and those data flows are specifically what touches the card information, right? So that's where card information flows within the environment. So those could be very useful for you if you're doing something specifically around zero trust, around that specific set of data. But also it's a great example to bring to a business analyst in another area, or bring to somebody who owns another architecture and say, hey, I need something like this, right? Do you have something like this? Chances are a business analyst may already have created them as part of another engagement. So these transaction flows and understanding how data transfers within the environment really document how specific resources interact with that key data asset that we identify. You're connecting pieces of the DAS together to tell you where and when the data was accessed, right? While documentation is great, documentation is not reality, right? So it's always good to verify the documentation by using logs. And because, where I came from, I know I love a good traffic capture, right? And understanding where that traffic comes from. There's lots of tools out there that can help in this, and understanding this traffic can be quite complicated. But using things like network traffic analyzers and using things like firewalls, you can start understanding who's having access to what, right? And then we get to the fun part, right? Finally, we get to architect. Now that we've gathered all this information, we've reviewed the assets, apps, services, and now we get to map the controls to what makes sense for your security level. So looking at assets, applications, and services that access the data, identify the level controls that make sense for the area you're looking at and make sense from your business perspective. So this next slide is sort of a modified version of what is in the Department of Defense document, right? So in terms of what they see as a baseline maturity level for zero trust, includes things like determining policies, segmenting the network, managing the assets, using certs and MFA, and encrypting data, right? and I like this level, I like this view, but I think from you know, we've interpreted and taken this interpreted a little better from um, uh, a CDW perspective, right? Like how we see our clients, in Canada using technology nowadays. So we simplified it a bit to say, hey, what are your objectives and what are the solutions that are out there that you could start mapping to those objectives, right? So if you're talking about in terms of identity, you want to move towards on-premise and cloud identity federations, or you want to integrate uh, with user directory, use a less privileged access model, conditional access. There are technologies on the right that will map to it, right? Looking at things like 2FA, MFA, or SSO are becoming more and more common in terms of conversation, and can get you to a better place in making sure that the right people are entering your environment and that you're getting that non-repudiation from a user perspective. Obviously, device policy, right, and making sure devices the device authorization is happening. EDR, XDR can help from a visibility perspective, can help from understanding the pattern of access on a day-to-day basis, and then tying those things to things like network access control, right? NAC used to be a very switch port driven conversation, and NAC has become much more of a posture assessment type connection, right? Before VPN happens, before you enter into this network, you'll have a posture assessment from your devices. So there are tools that can help there. From a network cloud perspective, having in microsegmentation is, it has been a conversation for a number of years. And those who manage networks know that this is much easier said than done, right? So I would put microsegmentation, not in the if you think of walk, crawl, walk, run, I would put somewhere between the walk and run area, right? Microsegmentation generally for a whole organization is very difficult to get, and that's where looking at a specific project, looking how it's run, and allowing some technology, network enclaves that are not covered to be segmented is also important, right? Encryption, much more common than it used to be, much more easier to implement nowadays with things like security brokers and SSL inspection and firewalls. And then blocking and alerting and unauthorized access for all kinds of network connections. In terms of other objectives you may have in terms of applications, right? Doing a proper application permissions, monitoring abnormal app behaviors, controlling user actions, all those in-depth pieces become a little more complicated, right? We're moving up the stack here, and application security review and testing can be part of it. Understanding application segmentation using things like a CASB, or using things like a web application firewall to control that level of communication, right? Where that control is fairly close to the data. So the closer we get to the data, the more complex the controls are, and the more we need to understand the flows and how the business works, right? So those pieces are really in that moving forward towards that run side of the house. So, and then from a data perspective, data classification, data encryption, data loss prevention, and secure key management, complex pieces, but if you take a small bite, those aren't too difficult to do if you keep your focus small. So what are some of the common pitfalls that we see our clients run into when they try to implement zero trust architectures? The number one is expecting perfection, right? Reading through too many documents, too many standards documents, and saying, hey, I'm just going to go around my organization and I'm going to make sure everything's perfect, right? Expecting perfection is a common pitfall we see. People are taking really too big of steps, and building that roadmap needs to be a slow but a steady move towards a healthy state. Obviously, making the scope too large, right? Looking at too many things at once, trying to cover it all, or get it in somewhere where it's too big, and also expanding the scope during the discovery phase, right? Once you start looking for your data and you find, well, my data is an email, my data is everywhere within the organization, that makes it very difficult to say, okay, well, all these systems are now within scope, and I'm going to have to add MFA to all these pieces. I want to make sure every connection is encrypted. Expanding that scope during the discovery phase can be very tricky, right? So try not to boil the ocean when it comes to your scope again, right? And then think of cultural issues, right? One of the things that happen with zero trust is we get that emotional response, right? The emotional response from the users or people in the organization when we are used to the term zero trust, right? We hear it everywhere. We see it in every time you read security news that shows up somewhere, or somebody's got an idea about it. We're all at a webinar about it. But other parts of the organization may not have the same feel, right? So using the term needs to be explained. There's sort of this, in the term triggers that emotional response to say, hey, you don't trust anyone in our organization. Why don't you trust our clients? Why don't you trust our vendors? And why don't you trust me, right? Being a security practitioner for a number of years, we don't even trust ourselves. So this is a tricky conversation to have, but an important conversation that we need to have, right? So where I wanted to take this forward is, I wanted to loop in KJ here because I want to talk about the perspective from the other side of the fence, right? Like KJ said in his intro, KJ has worked with me for 6 years in this organization. We've had many interesting conversations about IT, and I absolutely love that he's here because he gives us a completely different perspective, and I think it's a healthy perspective of somebody who's not living completely outside security, but is highly involved in security, but also involved in making sure that the other parts of the IT business are important. So KJ, these are obviously, you've seen these questions. So I'm going to let you run with the slide. I'm going to take a break, have a glass of water, and we can come back for discussion.
Yeah, I feel kind of bad because I was able to get top billing on the slide there right next to you, and I'm not doing nearly as much work. So yeah, I think zero trust as a concept and really as a framework of a way to approach security, I'm really excited about as somebody who's not necessarily focused on security all the time. And I think we can point to a couple of areas where just naturally zero trust is sort of permeating into our environments. But I wanted to give an example of I like the example around physical security. And when I was working, in IT and in operations, we actually had a pen test that was done, and one of the things they did was a physical office penetration test, and they literally reached through a gap in the doors with a yardstick and pushed the button so they could walk into the building, and one of the things that came out on the report was that multiple people had walked by while they were doing this and nobody had said anything. And so to me, like security is really something that's it's incumbent upon everybody to kind of do their part. And so one of the challenges, but also I think one of the assets of something like zero trust as a framework is it really does involve everybody. It takes everybody looking at security to make that work. And so I was thinking about the apartment and having your own house, and I like the house. I like the villa, and I want that to be I want that to be my place. But I was kind of thinking of the key under the mat is the equivalent to the password that's on the post-it note, taped up to somebody's monitor. And we've definitely moved past that, from a sophistication perspective. And so one of the things that's starting to show that security is really permeating into everybody's minds is when you look at things like our cloud report. So, annually, this will be the second cloud report we'll be publishing in a short amount of time, in February. And the top bit of the cloud report where people are interested, people are investing is security for the cloud. And so, even where we have areas where we're not necessarily focusing on security is becoming one of the prime topics that we're helping customers and deal with, but also that are top of mind for our customers. So really looking at the changes that we've seen, and I like the discussion around some of the changes to where people are working one of the things we talk about a lot is edge computing. And so, when you think about operating at the edge of your network, in retail at the stores, or in an IoT network that's maybe at an operations facility. And when you look at starting to secure that and putting up the right security boundaries, not just from a networking perspective, but from a role-based access control and identity management. And it's really daunting when you start to look at things individually. And sometimes when you have that framework and you have that puzzle, and you've worked it out amongst the teams, when you can come together and with that single vision, it makes it easier in the long run. And there's a couple areas where we see that already in place, and now we have the advantage of using that as an example on how to move forward. So when the different stakeholders that are within the business, developers are sometimes, and this will I'm kind of skipping ahead to answer a question a little bit, but developers and their developers as a stakeholder can really be great allies in a zero trust conversation, because those new applications that are being written, using microservices or using cloud native services or building in a cloud operating model way, you have the opportunity to influence those from the start. We have the opportunity to build these requirements into it, or in the case of public cloud, zero trust as a microsegmentation and a role-based access control, that's really built into it. And so, one of the key takeaways from our cloud report last year was security is a huge benefit for organizations that have built cloud natively or built with containers, in the cloud, and not gone back and said, okay, well, let's allow all this traffic. Like, okay, we need the application working, so let's just allow an any and let things happen. Where organizations have done assessments and taken what they know about the applications, looked into their CMDBs, looked at network scans and logs, and really built, okay, what is the minimum viable connections that we require for this? They've really been successful, because that's how the public cloud is really meant to be consumed. So developers can be a great asset in that. And a lot of developers don't want to worry about security. Security is something that they want to work with a team that can handle it, and not worry about how their security aligns with their compliancy. And that operations teams, I think operations teams, if they aren't going through this change, or they haven't gone through this change, the idea of the infrastructure as code, and really managing templates and code as opposed to managing individual devices is critical as we go forward. And so, where your operations teams have started to leverage tools like Ansible and Terraform, and they're building things as code and deploying, that becomes really powerful as well, because not only does that really support the idea of you're building those zero trust policies into that code, but it also allows for easier testing earlier in the process. And so now those zero trust policies, that zero trust framework, when you're building that as code, your test and QA teams are using that as part of their process now. So again, you may have some really good allies in this discussion with your operations teams, because they're already doing the codifying their deployments, and again, including your needs as security consultants into that, drives a lot of value. And so I think from an operations perspective, where you can help with their maturity, where you can help them do testing, there's fewer outages when they actually go to do pushes. Like, those, again, that's a quality of life improvement. And I think you can build a good relationship where you're really supporting them ahead of time. And then line of business, the line of business stakeholders are really concerned about their application. They're concerned about getting that value to market quickly. They're concerned about finding that new revenue source, or providing that new feature to their customers, whether they're internal or external to the organization. And so they want to speed up the process. And when you have a good understanding of the shared security model, when you've aligned your zero trust strategies with that, and your security strategies with that shared security model, with zero trust as kind of a framework, it means you can start to trust in the natural development of those tools, and really speed up for the agility part of it. And so just something as simple as being able to include, your RBAC policies, in your QA environment that map directly to your production environment, like just those types of integrations, I think allow for greater agility. And so I think whether it's operations, whether it's security, we are all working on how do we optimize the way that we approach things. And a lot of times the cloud operating model is a great reference for that. But how do we take advantage of that in our data center, across our public infrastructure, tie in our SaaS services? And so being able to build that as infrastructure as code, being able to manage those templates as opposed to individual devices, I think that then allows us to be more agile and more responsive to the business's needs. So I think, in my opinion, those are different stakeholders, kind of their different views of zero trust. And I think it's incumbent upon us to collaborate with those stakeholders so that they understand this really is a net benefit for them. It really is a net benefit to go through that security rigor up front and not be trying to take care of that as a step at the end of the process, right?
Yeah, it's interesting, KJ, because before this call, we were actually having a conversation about the Uber Eats email coming into people's mailboxes, and how that could feel like a phishing attack, right? Everybody's getting an email, which it isn't. But in this case, but what's interesting is, we were, KJ and I is talking as practitioners, but Cassandra from our marketing team say, yeah, I used to get those, I know about those, I'm aware of that, right? And that conversation has really progressed from where it used to be, right? It used to be that cybersecurity awareness was not a conversation that we were having, right? So maybe in this same way, zero trust needs to be a conversation we start permeating on the IT and on the business side of the house to say, hey, if I'm writing NetSec code and security, if I'm writing code for my network and I'm storing it on GitHub, I want to make sure that it's secure, right? And understanding all those pieces within it maybe is something that we can culturally educate the same way we educated people on phishing, and the same way we educate people on malware and what to do and not do as well, right? But more of a sort of a master class on security for the rest of the organization.
Yeah, and I think culturally, a lot of times the challenges are, um, everybody's measured in different ways, and so operations teams are going to a lot of times be measured on uptime metrics and user experience, actually consuming the production applications. Developers a lot of times in the teams are how quickly can we get this out the door? Are we hitting our targets? We've got a bunch of sprints that we're trying to do. How many of those are we hitting? How many problems are we resolving, between sprints? And security teams, obviously you're being measured on your preparedness, and has there been a breach? And so I've always found inside of organizations that it's really powerful to for the stakeholders that you're trying to get to go along with you to really understand what's in it for them. And so, developers, we want to give you a the guidelines that you need to develop successfully. And part of this, when you start to look at the very, very mature part of the spectrum of zero trust or site reliability engineering, or any of these, really start to become, the developers are putting hooks and calls and data feeds out of their applications that are helping the security team be more successful, or that are integrating with some of these security platforms. And so it really, at the end of the day, it can become this reciprocal relationship where security is taking care of their part of the responsibility, but the developers, the application teams, the operation teams are now feeding more data to security so they can be more successful, which then correlates to the developers and the operations teams being more successful. So I think those are good. It's also, the other thing I've always noticed that this seems to really resonate with people is where they've already done the work, where they've already put the effort in, take advantage of that. And so, a lot of the same things you need to properly do, microservices, or sorry, microsegmentation on networking, it really comes down to the same types of things you need to know to do disaster recovery for those solutions and build the environment you're going to do disaster recovery to. A lot of times restricting and really making that sort of minimum viable security or access in place is the same thing that you need when you start to do compliancy around some access to some of your financial information and legal information, et cetera. And so sometimes organizations start these processes, and just by getting the right teams involved, they realize we've already done the work. or we're already doing a disaster recovery, a detailed business continuity plan. And as part of that, there's outputs that can then, maybe make zero trust and some of the, the various processes that you outlined, Evo, easier to be successful. So yeah, I think culturally, I find that if you can explain what's in it for them, if you can really draw a way that forward that makes their jobs easier, and then where you have spent the time to do the work, take advantage of it in as many ways as possible. So yeah, I find those two things work very well to work through the cultural roadblocks that you run into.
Oh, that's good. I also like the idea you've implemented of a security KPI for everybody. So that resonates really well, and I'm sure it resonates a lot with the security practitioners here. Again, KJ, fantastic. Thank you for having me. You deserve top billing. Your thoughts
No.
are super valuable in this. And I want to, I've got one more slide, a closing slide that I wanted to give, which is just further reading, right? I mentioned these two of these. Microsoft is a great document implementing zero trust at Microsoft. Microsoft technology will permeate your environment, whether you implement all of their controls or not. They are a big piece of where organizations are going. So I believe we're sharing this this deck with everybody, and you'll have these links in order to get access to this. Again, thank you everybody for your time. I don't know if we have probably have a few minutes. We could take a couple of questions. I don't know if any have showed up.
Yeah, so there is a question from Neil Patterson. Thanks for submitting the question, Neil. I'll go ahead and read it. If you want to respond, I think there's a little bit maybe I can speak to as well. So zero trust networking can be achieved by software-defined network or other overlay networks, or products or solutions. Do you have any ideas for incorporating legacy networks in those in that software-defined networking? And are there solutions, products, or methodologies we would recommend?
I mean, legacy is a broad term, right? There are there are controls that you could even put into 80s and 90s networks that are one-way communication technologies. There are things you can do from a simple, even editing, even cutting a cable, removing a few pieces from an RJ45 cable will give you some level of control within those networks, right? In order to segment those networks, obviously you have to I think identifying the flows and talking about what we talked from a high level is important. But when we talk about microsegmentation and network segmentation, there are products that will focus specifically on those networks. Your more common product sets are very focused on new and an exciting side of things, right? Supporting later technologies. But there are in these documents, there are the concept of network enclaves, right? Where you're saying, hey, the technology in this network is too important and can't be upgraded. Therefore, we need to add controls around it, right? And that's where things like VDI can be really useful, right? To say, hey, there's a jump box, there's a controlled environment here where you come in and you can only access through that, right? You can MFA into that, you can add all those fancy controls, and then from there have access to those least modern networks as well. So I don't know, KJ, how much you would add to that, but I know that you've done some work on that side too.
Yeah, also like the word legacy networks because depending upon if you're as old as I am or or legacy could be so. Um, from my past, we had our processing facilities ran off of DECnet originally, and one of the things that they did to modernize that at the time, this would have been almost 20 years ago. Um, they they were able to add transceivers and make it DECnet over TCP/IP, and that was both good and bad. It was good from the sense that now we had a way to bring in additional services and do patching to those machines and things where before where we had a Windows box that was kind of isolated and it was connected with these DECnet connections. We didn't have the availability to do that. It also now extended our security needs to that network and OT systems and services. They tend to be problematic in that the software doesn't get updated as often. A lot of times it's very niche, but it's also critical to the business. And so I would say, with legacy networks, you have to decide, where can you effectively do your security and create that boundary. And sometimes an air gap is the right way to secure those types of things. And as Evo's mentioning, maybe it's a jump box that goes through another type of security before you access it. When you start talking about newer networks and newer applications that are being developed, a lot of times you're just building those into the foundation of the application and knowing that you're building a microservices application. It has to use the network. I'm going to tag data. I'm going to create linkages between the layers of my application that are going to use specific ports, and they're going to communicate in a specific way. And so mapping those that interconnectivity is just natural for newer modern applications. I think when we start to get into network segmentation, at a VLAN layer or subnets and things, that's where again it's still the egg. It's hard on the outside, but it's soft and squishy on the middle. And so I think that with those, there are a lot of products, but I think it's gonna a bit depend on what your starting point is. So, Evo made a good point early on, and I love the fact that we're really talking about the space. We're not talking about a product per se. There are all sorts of products based on where you're at right now today, where you can leverage your existing investment and then move forward your, zero trust and your other security goals and objectives, right? So I would say it depends, and I'm quoting a Cisco comment I heard earlier today, uh, and but again, those are areas where we have solutions architects and we engage and we help drive that conversation forward. So I would say that are there ways? Yes. Depending upon what your technology is, there are different software overlays, there's different management tools and overlays. There's even some HCI vendors that can do that within their HCI stack because they have networking and storage and everything all included. So it depends on where you're at.
Yeah, I think talk to your CDW architect, right? I think that's what we're here to do. Like that's what we're here to help with. Um, I also like that they asked us about legacy networks, KJ. I don't know whose beard is grayer, but we may have to add a slide at the end of this called "Back in My Day," where we talk about how things used to be, right? So no, this is fantastic. I know we're running out of time. I don't know if we have time for one more question. We're at 2 minutes. I want to respect everybody's time.
Yeah, we didn't have anything else in the chat, but I echo your thoughts, Evo. We have great solutions architects, they're pre-sales resources. If you want to compare technologies, you want to talk about options and potentials, reach out to your account manager, your account executive.
Yeah.
I love being on calls with Evo's team. I learn a lot, and they are. I mean, this is what they do. This is their passion. So.
Yeah, and vice versa too. I mean, a great project is a project where my team says, "Hey, I'm out of my depth in this technology because it's so new or because it's so complex, and I need to bring in the cloud team from CDW, right? two very strong, lots of experience within these organizations to help solve that problem, right? So enough of a sales pitch. I think I can do that for a while, but absolutely. Thank you everybody for joining, and thank you KJ for supporting me here today and giving me a little time to drink water and breathe. Thank you very much, and have yourselves a great rest of your day, and thank you for joining.
Thanks again. Be safe.
Be safe.